Previously on agentpalmer.com, a guest post about the Star Wars Book of Sith. You can see anything you want at Alice's Restaurant the movie, and I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. This is the Palmer Files, Episode 7, with the reigning lunatic himself, Geoffrey Welchman, where we talk about origins for the Reigning Lunatic Podcast, all points in our past leading us to podcasting, and for one final time, I bothered Geoffrey to resurrect the Reigning Lunatic. Let's do the show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this episode is podcast royalty, the king known as the Reigning Lunatic, Geoffrey Welchman. Now, the Reigning Lunatic Podcast was a 9-episode miniseries that aired in late 2015, early 2016. It was a scripted sitcom set in a despotic medieval kingdom plagued by dragons, wizards, and dreadful Wi-Fi. I came to know about this show from who else but Tin, the Royal Public Relator, voiced by my good friend Grant Markham. He was only in episode 9, so by the time I got to this series, I was able to binge the entire thing, which I urge you to do. So, the Reigning Lunatic Podcast is what brought Geoffrey and I together, but perhaps it would have happened anyway. Not only are our stories very similar in how we got into podcasting and the skills and things that led us to podcasting, but we were basically hanging around the fringes of overlapping circles. Since the Reigning Lunatic's last episode in April of 2016, Geoffrey and I have stayed in touch, and all I know is that while on this episode I asked him for the final answer on the possible return to Welchmania for the Lunatic, I didn't say I had to give up asking him for new content. Sorry, Geoffrey. Geoffrey was another one of those potential guests that sprouted up on the initial list of people I might want to have on a podcast if I ever launched one. Well, 7 episodes in, and here he is. Now, since it's very important that you get an actual feel for what the Reigning Lunatic Podcast is, here's a clip from episode 2 that will give you a taste.
And as you can hear, we're speeding westwards in the royal carriage on a top-secret mission. Captain of the Guards, how much further is it?
Only a few leagues, my liege. But I must reiterate, this journey is full of risk.
And it's fiendishly expensive, sire.
What do you mean, old Grimsby the accountant? And what are you doing in my private carriage anyway?
Cutting costs, sire.
How?
It's a most economical new trend called carriage pooling, sire.
Piffle!
While my only concern is your safety, sire.
Why? Is my brother hatching another plot to assassinate me?
Of course, sire, but it's not that.
What else could it be, then? All I care about is repairing and finishing the Grand Border Wall. Driver, stop the carriage.
As you wish, sire. Whoa! I say you, peasant girl.
Me? Goodness, is that the royal seal?
Yes, he likes to sit up top.
Are you our monarch?
Heavings, girl, we're on a secret mission. How could you tell I'm royal?
The neon crown that adorns the carriage, sire.
Ah.
Sire, I am but a chaste maiden whose mother warned never to talk to strange monarchs.
Who told your mother I was strange?
Geoffrey and I will soon get into the conversation where we start off with inspirations and origins of the Reigning Lunatic Podcast. But before we move on, I'd like to take a moment to talk to you about small, independent podcasts. Podcasts like mine, and those of my current guest and previous guests, the Wicked Theory Podcast, How Was Your Week, Honey, the Podcast Digest, the Best Neighbors Podcast, the Modern Myth with Tristan Boyle, the Fourth Line Podcast, and Inverse Delirium Podcast all enjoy podcasting, but we all want feedback too. Now, there are monetary ways to support all of these shows in some way or another, or at least at one time there was, but feedback, even more than reviews on the platform you consume podcasts, is very important. So, over the course of the next few weeks, spend a little time sending a tweet or an email or a message to the podcasters whose shows you enjoy. Let them know what it means to you to listen and why you enjoy them. It will go a long way in making the day or even week of those people behind the mics at your favorite show. Now, one of those shows for me was Geoffrey Welchman's The Reigning Lunatic. And since I was able to infiltrate the kingdom of Welchmania, we should get this introduction moving. But you know the drill. Before we get into the episode proper, you can hear Geoffrey in back episodes of his shows, The Reigning Lunatic and Inverse Delirium podcasts. You can also follow him on Twitter at Welchmania. You can also follow this show at The Palmer Files and me at Agent Palmer. Of course, all these links and those mentioned in the show will be in the show notes. So, without further ado, let us away to the conversation. Geoffrey, where did the inspiration for The Reigning Lunatic come from?
Well, it came from a couple of places. Mainly, it was sort of a combination of Monty Python, basically, and the Holy Grail. Sort of that whole movie was such a wonderful world that they created that that was a big part of it. And then, of course, there was this English radio comedy show from the 50s that actually inspired all the British guys from the 60s, including Monty Python. It was called The Goon Show, and Peter Sellers was one of the three people. He became a huge star, of course. Spike Milligan wrote most of the shows, and he was just insane. I mean, literally, well, I shouldn't say that. He was mentally ill, which he was very forthright about, and which was amazing considering it was the 60s. He was clinically depressed, and anyway, long story short, he wrote very off-the-wall, surreal comedy, and it was just performed so well. Peter Sellers did 1 million voices. This other guy, Harry Seacombe, was the hero type of all the stories. And so that was sort of a jumping off point. I'm not Peter Sellers, and I'm not the writer that Spike Milligan or Monty Python, all of those guys could write great comedy and also very surreal stuff. That is a long-winded answer of what inspired me to do this.
Well, so first of all, did you grow up in Baltimore?
No, I grew up in New England in a town called Pomfret, Connecticut. Okay,
because at the end of your episodes, I know it's, you have a wonderful tag that I feel like is like an homage to those classic radio programs. But New England, Northeast, I get the feeling that you got your Python from PBS.
Oh, yes, definitely.
So,
well, and actually also my dad was born in England.
Okay.
And so he actually heard the Goon Show. And then his father, my grandfather, who was Gordon Welchman, he was a code breaker in World War II and worked with Alan Turing and all this stuff. He was fascinated with tape recorders, and he taped a lot of these shows off the radio with reel-to-reel recorders. This was back in the day. And so he then transferred them all to cassettes so that we could listen to them. So here I was, a kid in the 70s, listening to comedy from England of the 50s. And the whole family loved it. And then, of course, when Monty Python started to show up on PBS, yes, we were watching every episode. Absolutely.
So that explains how you get this older radio. But, I mean, a lot has happened since then. First of all, I mean, not even why podcast, but like, why audio? I mean, obviously, video is a completely different beast, but there's animation, there's all these other platforms from which you could have, easily taken this script. Why did it end up being, audio one and then a podcast?
Well, I had done a podcast that was called The Inverse Delirium for 4 years, and that was like also short. I liked the idea of producing something short. It ended up being about 15 minutes long, and it started as sort of a spoof of public radio, basically. I called it a look at life in this American Baltimore or something. And so because I do have kind of a NPR type voice, I was the host and I was writing sketches, and it was a very, basically a sketch comedy thing set in a public radio setting. And so we did that for a long time. My wife ended up helping a lot with ideas because she's also really funny. And so that was kind of an effort that just snowballed. And by the end of it, I was getting like really big name comedians to be on the show. I had Lewis Black was on one. Kevin Pollak was on one. He agreed to do a sketch I'd written. I mean, it was just blowing me away that people who I really, think are just amazing writers and performers would do, would do my little sketches and send me the tape so that I could cut it together as a podcast. So I was just so frazzled at the end of it from trying to track people down and book new, guests, and you'll know all about this. Getting to the point where I was recording and then taking 20 hours to edit it together with all the sound effects and putting the voices in the right places and stuff like that. So it just did me in, and I finally just had to pull the plug. And that was in 2014. And after quite a rest, my wife and I were just sort of joking around, and she came up with the name Reigning Lunatic off of Raging Lunatic, and I forget what we were talking about, but I immediately just went with that title. I loved it, and we started riffing and came up with ideas about like, it's a king, and he needs a wife, but he keeps putting them in the dungeon, and then he's got a brother who wants to kill him, of course, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And just it just sort of started to take shape. And that's typically how I used to do sketches. If I wrote them myself, that was one thing. But if she came up with an idea, we'd sort of back and forth banter it out and flesh it out, and then I would write it up. And so I just basically started writing scripts and was having so much fun writing the scripts, really. And initially I thought it was just going to be something that I could do with, very few people, rather than the problem with Inverse Delirium was getting guests, lining them up, getting them to record what I wanted, getting them to get it back to me. You know how that is, trying to book people and, sort of keep your schedule. That's the hardest thing about podcasting, because you really got to learn to manage your time.
It's also, I was a part of, and I've talked about this on a few other episodes, but I was a part of the behind the scenes of Chronicles Unwritten, which Diamond Dave was basically writing an audience choose your own adventure, which was more of a B at the end of every episode. And then, he would write based on a poll and all this kind of stuff. And originally it was Dave wrote it. I edited the copy, and then he sent it off, and Tristan, who was the fifth guest for this show, was the narrator. And that was great for like 2 or 3 episodes. And listen, there's that one, right? Like Dave's got a full-time job. I've got a full-time job. Tristan's got a job.
Yes.
And the fact that Dave's in, I think he was in British Columbia somewhere. I'm on the East Coast of the US, and Tristan's in Scotland. And we had to wait for the episode to come out to see what the audience said so Dave could write wherever the story was going to go. And that was one thing. But then Dave, for whatever reason, was like, well, Tristan doesn't need to do it all, so we'll get another person to do another voice. And I think towards the end of Chronicles Unwritten, there were like 4 voices on any one given episode. But even that spread across whatever it was. I mean, yours, I have since come to know some of the people behind the scenes. I mean, I got to know about your podcast, The Reigning Lunatic, the first time through Tin, the Royal Public Relaterer.
Oh, yes. I just heard that today. Grant. Yeah.
Because Grant was on it and he was talking about it. And I didn't know Courtney at the time. I know Courtney now. I recognize some of the other names. They're also spread around too. So you undertook this and you write the script. Let's get back to that for a second. Like,
Yeah.
you wrote it. Was it, were all 9 parts there? I mean, you talked about wanting to keep it short, or, like, what was it after that first draft, I guess?
Oh, okay. So, well, after the first show and after the first script, I guess, I just looked in my old archive, and I had scripts up to 17, but I don't think that the last 2 were finished. There were definitely a few more, actually, that I wanted to get to, really, but I just, it was a situation where, real life intruded. I had a new job, and I really needed to, just give them my all, because there was kind of a learning curve involved for me. And I was using lessons that I'd learned from all my audio work. Oh, yeah, I never answered your question, why audio, did I?
No, but we can...
Oh, we can circle back.
Yeah, we can circle back. But, I mean...
Yeah.
That's a lot of content. Did you ever think of maybe it's just... Because you had these other sketch shows in mind, was it always going to be kind of like an ensemble piece?
Yeah. When I started writing it and I started thinking about doing it, one of the things that appealed about it was that it was a continuous story. And, I hadn't done that. And I thought that at the time, podcasts were starting to do that more. I can't think of that crazy one. Welcome to something. What was it called?
Oh.
Welcome to,
I'm going to blank it.
Well, okay. At any rate, there were some podcasts that were doing continuous stories or short stories and stuff like that I thought were interesting. So, and again, once I started writing, that's really kind of the most fun, apart from finally editing it and putting it together for me. Performing it is great. And well, anyway, to step back. So I envisioned it as a continuous story with a smallish cast. Like what you're talking about, like 4 people I could count on would have been great. And when I started to write it and started to talk to some people, there was one guy in particular who I kind of envisioned us doing it together and him doing a fair share of the voices. I was doing, I don't know, I did like 5 or 6 or something in the finished product. I don't actually know. But of course, when I did the draft of the show, I would do all the parts. I would read the script and do all the parts and kind of time it out so that I knew, how things would fit together. Then I would send a script or I would have somebody over, like the woman Catherine who did the voice of the ingenue, Griselda. She came and basically read parts for like 3 or 4 shows that she was in at one time, because I just wanted to budget things, and I always had her in mind for that, and whatever other female parts I could convince her to do, because I really liked I just liked the way she did it. She'd been on Inverse Delirium once or twice, and I thought she did a great job, and she did accents well too. So but there were other podcast friends like Monica Hamburg, who you may know through podcasting, Twitter, whatever, and Mark Hershon, of course, who had been really, really supportive of Inverse Delirium with his show, Succotash. He had been on Inverse Delirium as well a couple of times, and so it was people like that I knew and liked, and sort of they seemed to appreciate my humor and the scripts that I'd shown them. So they were the people I turned to when I needed like one extra voice or one solid voice person to do, what I thought was a good part, that kind of thing. So yeah, Grant ended up being on it. And in fact, Jason I intended to have him on the show too, Ginger, but it just never worked out. And then I stopped because I was exhausted again. And as I say, I changed jobs and I just didn't have the time.
Spoiler alert. I'm going to tout the fact that everybody should go listen to this, but it's 9 episodes. Yes, and you end abruptly, but you do it in a, like you break the fourth wall throughout the entire process of this show anyway.
Yeah.
So the way you end it is really good. But like, and I'm sure, I know you've gotten this from me a lot on Twitter, and I'm going to ask it once during this show and leave it alone. But like, is there ever going to be any more?
I don't think so. I really don't. I can't imagine, if 10,000 people suddenly want to hear the Reigning Lunatic series, then sure, maybe I'd do one more or something. But I mean, it just, my head isn't sort of there anymore. I've been more involved in music lately, to be honest. So it would no.
Well, I guess you
sorry.
were. I mean, listen, your head was very ahead of the time. You were ahead of the curve, and I can understand why. Not only your head's not there, but like there's a bit of satire in this series. But you're talking about gender equality. You're talking about taxes,
that's right.
and you're talking about a wall.
Yes.
Throughout a good portion of it, well before any of the current state of the political climate in the United States right now. So
it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, listening to it, I just go like, well, I mean, somebody hearing this for the first time in 2019 or even 2020 could go, well, this is in response to, right?
Yeah.
But it's not.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's so right there, but I mean, and this is the thing that if you listen to any satirist and even comedians right now, just because of the craziness of the world, comedy and satire are hard because any ridiculousness you can come up with has to be crazier, so to speak, but within reason than what the headlines say. And that's a tight race these days. That's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's sure. And I'm happy to address that actually, because I did start writing it before Trump, announced that he was going to be running for president. I mean, he flirted so long over such a long period of time with running and stuff like that. But I think he declared in 2015, and I'd certainly been writing I did hit on this idea of a grand border wall, and then he was running, and then he was talking about a wall all the time. And so when I was putting them out, I did, mostly I only just sort of publicized on Twitter and Facebook, basically. I did sort of hint that this show was about a mad king who wanted to build a wall around his kingdom, and so the parallel was there. But I certainly didn't start out with the idea of satirizing Trump at all, or any leader, really. It was just like, a funny character idea that I thought could stretch into a few episodes.
Well, I mean, I think it works. Before we go back to the question of why audio, I want to talk to you about breaking the fourth wall.
Uh-huh.
It didn't happen that often in Python. It was more like a nod to the camera, which obviously is not something you can do in audio. But did the Goon show, right?
Oh yeah,
Did they?
Yes, the Goon show.
Did they break the fourth wall? Like, I mean, or is this just you've picked this up
constantly.
from other things?
Yeah, no, that was a very, very much a Goon show thing.
Okay,
that they were constantly addressing the listener, directly with information about the story, and then stepping outside it and making a joke and coming back in, and that's the biggest inspiration, that it was very much a radio show with radio rules about, the logic of the situation they're in, which being completely auditory, you can just bend all sorts of rules that you cannot bend when there's a visual happening, and so that was really attractive to me. Monty Python also did, and I'm sorry, I say Monty Python out of habit. I know it's Python in America, and I am American. I did grow up here, but out of habit, I just say some things a little Englishy.
I mean, listen, to me, it's Monty Python, because I remember, same as almost anybody from certain generations, like on PBS on Saturday night, it was Monty Python's Flying Circus.
Yeah, exactly. And but the other thing about them is that they did record albums, long players that were the way I heard some of the sketches first, because they released them constantly. Actually, there were 3 or 4 really, really good records where they the first one wasn't so great. The second one was better. The third one, they're really getting into the possibilities of sound, and they're doing sketches strictly for the records that never show up on the show because they're audio based. The gags are sound effects or whatever they are. And so, I mean, that's something that Python fans should really seek out, because the shows are amazing. The TV show is great. The movies are great. I've basically been obsessed with them for forever. I would throw in a couple of others though. For old comedy fans, the Firesign Theater was kind of like an American Monty Python, but they started in radio and they did LPs. They did albums during the late 60s and 70s. Very far out, very, very surreal, very absurd, but very American too. So kind of a different flavor. But they were influenced by the Goon show as well, along with, American radio comedy, Jack Benny, whatever came, that kind of thing. And then, of course, Mr. Show. I'm sure you're a fan of that, right? Mr. Show was like the closest thing I think America ever came to a Monty Python type show, where the sketches weaved together. They didn't necessarily, it didn't follow, but somehow it just felt like it flowed, and they were very silly. So while that's a video show, I definitely feel like they were an inspiration as well. So the fact that I did sort of grow up hearing this very influential British comedy in radio form and audio form from albums. I was a big Bill Cosby album listener. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say that anymore, but unmistakably he was
at the time. His records
right.
were huge. What's there's the one with his brother in the title.
To Russell, my brother, who I slept with. Yeah.
I mean that. Yeah. I still have that album. I mean, because there are things on that album that just are. It's so odd. I don't have a problem talking about it because I have no problem separating the man from the art. But
yeah, I do, unfortunately. Okay. I mean, I do have that problem with him now, and for quite a while. But and Woody Allen, for instance, I have trouble. I mean, I can't really go back and listen. Although, yeah, they were a huge thing to me. I listened to those albums over and over when I was a kid, and so anyway, I'm not crazy.
What I was going to ask was, though, did you get into some of the harder stuff? Because if Cosby's over here is more of like a general comedian, Pryor is a different thing. But you were just like a comedy fiend at that point. Like it was everything.
Yeah, I went through a phase when I was living in New York in my 20s where, I was trying to be a musician. I was trying to do rock music and bands and stuff. But I was also collecting stand-up comedy albums, all sorts of stuff. Dick Gregory, Godfrey Cambridge, Richard Pryor, of course, some Carlin. I was a huge Robert Klein fan. So those albums were a big deal to me as far as, consuming comedy, to the point where I actually almost prefer listening to a comedy album over seeing a comedian live. I mean, I like seeing comedians live, and I've seen some great comedians. I've seen Lewis Black, I've seen Patton Oswalt, and Gary Gulman, and all sorts of people. Paula Poundstone, she's amazing. All sorts of folks. But somehow, from all those years of listening, I kind of trained myself to listen to comedy. So audio comedy, podcast, it all sort of made sense. I mean, when I first started the Inverse Delirium, I realized that Logic, which is a kind of souped up version of GarageBand on the Mac, the program that a lot of people, start recording with, had all these sound effects in it. And I just suddenly thought, well, I could do my own Goon show or a Python kind of sketch. And I just started from there. I wrote a sketch about a team of biologists following a pod of walruses, and they try to provoke a response, and they throw a grenade, and the walruses pick up machine guns and start firing back, and it was sort of intended to be like a cross between an embedded journalist in like Iraq or something, which was still kind of a thing, and a nature documentary team story. So, and that's sort of where I jumped off from, very sort of very Python-y sketch. And then suddenly I was writing stuff and, starting to meet people in Baltimore to say, hey, you're the president of the Baltimore Bird Club. I have this sketch. I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading. I did that with this woman, the president of the Baltimore Bird Club, or former president and she agreed. And she came over to my house and she read the script for me and she played her part. And it must have seemed really odd at the time because nobody podcasting. I wouldn't say nobody knew what podcasts were in 2010, but it was not what it is now. Certainly, it's not what it was even 2-3 years ago, where it really kind of blew up with Serial and stuff.
Where's your background in all of this, right? Like, I get the inspiration. I understand that, writing is one thing, but saying, even for like Inverse Delirium, like where's the, did you have a technical background in any of this, or was it, well, that seems like something I want to do?
Oh, okay. The background is music, really. I was seriously trying to be a music in a very haphazard kind of way in New York. And even after that, when I moved to Baltimore in 2001, I was here. I was playing locally and recording myself, playing guitar and bass and drums and things like that. I put out a couple of CDs. Nothing really happened. And I ended up having this conversation with myself where I realized that my singing voice has always been kind of a stumbling block. I can carry a tune, but I don't have a voice that makes people go, oh, yeah, and some people like my voice as singing. Some people just really don't care for it. So whereas I realized that I've always gotten compliments on my speaking voice. People have always told me if I'm on the phone or something, people would just say, wow, your voice is really soothing or relaxing or whatever. And so, and I had started to do narration for my job where I produce e-learning, basically. I would narrate that stuff and people really responded well to it. So I started to think, a friend of mine had tried to get me hooked on podcasting and to start one because I used to send her tape letters back in college, and I would actually take a tape recorder around with me and sort of try and get people to talk on it and try to make it funny and stuff like this. So she had said, you should do podcasting, and with that focus on narration and all the good feedback I'd gotten, I thought, okay, I will do this. I will do something with my speaking voice, and I will try this. And so that's what happened. And then after Inverse Delirium, the Reigning Lunatic was like kind of a really sort of personal thing for me because of, my childhood and my dad's sense of humor being a very big thing in the family. It's the kind of thing that I sort of thought would make my sister laugh. Was what I was doing with the Reigning Lunatic, and it just had to be audio as a result.
I really like the idea because my short story into podcasting is that I hung around, I guested a lot, and I finally started my own show. But the longer story is a little bit more similar to yours in that, I went from playing saxophone in the band in middle and high school, and then I picked up a bass, and then I picked up a guitar, and then it was the middle or late 90s, and, I'm in a couple bands, so I'm the guy who's like, well, I'll buy what was at the time a Tascam 8-track Portastudio.
Oh, sure.
And somehow I also ended up with a 4-track mini portable Portastudio. I have no idea where either of them are to this day, and I'm thankful for that, because while I do still have cassette tapes, I don't remember what speed the Portastudio recorded at, but it recorded slowed down for when you were moving tracks around and stuff.
Yeah,
but
sure.
But what it means is, in the long game, because then to continue the story a little bit, in college I was in a 2-man band. I was Jason as a singer and guitarist, and my roommate Jason was the drummer. And we didn't go by the 2 Jasons because we played like a whole 5 times on campus, and that was it. But in our dorm room we had everything set up like permanent band practice. But when you fast forward to when I start getting around podcasts again, I'm not afraid of a microphone. I've sang into one. I'm used to it. That's fine. The ability to mix a board. Now, I mean, a few things aside from the Portastudio is like I did some sound crew with, plays and stuff in high school and college. But riding a board is also not intimidating. So now the two things outside of the actual recording and editing are no longer worries to me, because I'm comfortable around a microphone and I know how to ride a board. And then when you factor in that my college senior project was a 1-hour radio play I wrote, recorded, I put some music behind it. It was I was aiming for like a Prairie Home Companion storytelling kind of a deal. He never really did it for an hour. But I mean, I had to do something grandiose if I was going to graduate from college. So 1 hour, so I've got all this weird skill set in the back of my head that now when I tell you that on a podcast, it makes sense. It's like, oh, well, this is kind of works out, right? But until podcasting comes around, all of that stuff beforehand just means if I show up at a local theater that I can run their soundboard. It doesn't mean anything else, and you're not comfortable with anything. And so one of the more ironic things when I finally got back into podcasting was like, wait, people still use Audacity? Like in 2004, the spring of 2004, when I'm editing my final senior project in college, I'm using Audacity. And then I pulled it up to look at it, a decade late, and it hasn't changed a bit. I still can do it like easy. And it's just, all right, this makes sense. I got this. But I understand how the music side comes, because I still pick up my guitar and noodle around. But you will very rarely hear me sing, because I just don't have that kind of a voice. And if I ever did, it is now gone. Like, I don't even think I sound as good as I used to. And if you don't think you sound good, you don't sound good.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, what I can do is harmonize, and what I should have realized that, but I just liked singing anyway. So, and I wrote the songs, and actually that's kind of the preparation too, because when I started doing sketches, I understood layers, because I had recorded myself playing, a band's worth of instruments and working out the arrangements so that it sounds like a band means you're working with layers, you're working with parts and timing. And it was strange. I didn't have any problem with the transition, because once I wrote that sketch about the walruses and stuff, I started to put together, I went for sound effects. I went through what was already available in Logic, this software I use on the Mac, And of course, I was familiar with microphones as recording myself and all that stuff. So very similar to what you're saying. But also arranging a sketch so that it sounded like something. I mean, I went to this sound effects library called Sound Dogs. They do stuff for the pros. That's stuff that's out there on the web. You can buy sound effects there. And I remember one comment in particular that I just loved was some podcaster said, it's like listening to a movie, which was kind of what I was going for. I wanted stuff to sound good enough that you could relax and just trust that, okay, this does sound like, a sketch in an auto shop, for instance. Not that I did one, but just as an example, it sounded right, and then the voices, whether it was me doing, the host and another person doing a voice, that's sort of the general setup. Just that the background sounded right, that if there was music, that it was balanced right. Because so many podcasts frustrated me as somebody who was really into audio for being so poorly done. Even podcasts that I liked, for instance, weren't, recorded with an audio files, a real audio guy is kind of audio nerd is what I mean.
It's funny too, because that's something where, I mean, I like to say producer, because it's very much someone who's going to, step back, take a look at the full process and give you a direction on the end result. But I can hear the difference between, and every, listen, in podcasting, everybody's a hobbyist, right? I mean, even the big guys, whoever those are, do other things. They do live performances, Marin hasn't stopped being an actor or doing stand-up, Rogan's still doing other things, right? So it is still a hobby, even if it's a main source of income. It's most people need to do something else. But I can hear when somebody's taking pride in the product, right? Because it's more than just hitting record and talking into a microphone. Because if it was that simple, everyone could do it well. And I feel like that's the difference, because not everybody can do it well. You need to be able to edit. Even within a little bit, like, you don't have to edit so like every is gone, every so, like, you don't have to do that, but there are ways to edit out sound noise so that way the silence in between your pauses is actually dead silence and not your cat purring next to you.
Yeah, and that was the kind of detail I was after, because I mean, I started to understand how to record my voice better, what microphones were, really capable of, because I got better microphones, basically. So the sound was good. The sound, I mean, I was doing sound design. I didn't sort of realize it until I was 3 years in when I started to hear that term. That's kind of what I was doing. I was kind of like, really, one of the happiest things about working in audio is the amount of control I had, because I was writing scripts and asking people to really do what I was asking them to do, rather than do an interview show, which really had been kind of an inspiration with podcasting. Because when I decided to start one, I was mainly listening to 3 podcasts. It was Marin's show, of course, Kevin Pollak's show, which was his chat show, which was an interview thing, and then Doug Loves Movies. I mean, those were the things that I was listening to, and yet I really strongly felt like I want to go for sketch comedy. I want to do it clean. That was a decision I made right at the start, purely just because I thought more people, meant, that is, more people who might be open to it meant, a larger possible audience. And it ended up being kind of a good thing, because I had a line that I sort of couldn't cross, but I couldn't help but try, just sort of play with the line, so that I wasn't actually using swearing, but sometimes I'd throw something in, just very sort of mild, but mildly racy or whatever. It was a good sort of discipline, actually.
And it speaks to the art of a blank canvas, right? Like if I tell you to draw a face, it's I'm not telling you what face, who, what, where, I mean, you could give me the face of a coin. It doesn't matter. You can play with that, right? But it's a lot easier if I give you a blank canvas and say, draw a face, than if I give you a blank canvas and say, draw something.
Yeah.
And there is an extent to which art becomes contrived if there's too many rules and too many standards, but a few almost give you more to work with because it's just, well, now I don't have to worry about that. Like it goes, my blog is the same way. When I figured out, when the light bulb went off and I went, if I come up with a schedule and I have to write about Transformers on Thursday, then I can just sit down on Thursday and write about Transformers, as opposed to I have a post on Thursday and then sitting down on Thursday and going, what do I write about?
Yeah.
And then after I decide what I'm going to write about, I actually have to write about it. So taking one of those steps out was a huge benefit. And I feel like the other thing is, especially when it comes to explicit, right? You get to challenge yourself to see how close to the line you can get, which is, I mean, we're not all that hyper competitive externally, but I feel like a lot of us, especially like artists, are extremely competitive within our own heads. So it's like, oh, I did that, but can I do that better this time? And so it makes the process of creation a little bit more fulfilling and a little bit more stimulating, because otherwise it can get a little stale. And I mean, listen, you did 9 episodes and I'm pretty sure it didn't get stale for you.
Not stale, no. Although I wouldn't say I'm totally thrilled with every episode. I think there were a couple that weren't as strong, but I think what you're saying is, it makes perfect sense, because like with Reigning Lunatic, I just started out with a few rules, and it was set in medieval times, but they had Wi-Fi, so it didn't make any sense, but I just thought it would be funny to throw in some very current things like Wi-Fi and
there's an iPod. I mean, because I recognized that there were, it was medieval plus almost, right? Like it's medieval with like a few modern things.
Yeah, I mean, because I wasn't really. I'm not a medieval scholar, and I didn't really want to do tons of research, but I figured I knew enough to sort of get by, and then I just liked the idea of throwing in, whether it was an iPod or just a couple of sort of current references that would break it up, and I hoped would sort of be funny, basically.
I mean, they definitely play to laughs. I mean, the other thing, and I'm glad we're back to Reigning Lunatic, because I did want to ask, like, there's puns, but you don't go like over the top with the puns. Like there's a fine line that you somehow don't manage to cross.
Well, thank you.
Puns.
That's very generous of you, because I'm not sure I didn't do too many. I did. Puns just seemed to present themselves.
It's, they beget themselves. It's once you start, it's really hard to stop.
Yeah.
But I want to take a left turn for a moment, and I want to talk about music with you. We talked about comedy and radio, but I mean, music's a big part of. I see on Twitter that you're out doing gigs and playing again. But, what's the first inspiration for picking up an instrument, and what was it?
Oh, the Beatles. I was born in 1964, and that's the year that they arrived in the States. By the time I was 4, I was already a huge Beatles fan, and was playing Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour on a one of those old, not quite close and play record players that everybody had a record player. And they were it for me for a long time. Eventually I started to get into all sorts of music, whether it's reggae or old Delta blues, which was a big thing for me. Rock, funk, punk, new wave, reggae, all sorts of stuff. But it all started with me listening to the Beatles and wanting to be a Beatle. That was it.
How do you get the influence? Like I've talked on other podcasts about how lucky I am to be living within a close proximity to New York and Philly, because I get exponentially more radio stations, right? So, I get all these stations out of New York. I get all these stations out of Philly. I get my local stations. Obviously that's more now than it was then. Like, are we talking older brothers and older siblings, or, was there a local record store? 'Cause you're getting everything.
Well, when I was young, my dad, being a British guy who became an American citizen, I think the Beatles were a big novelty that seemed like, hey, this is a great British thing that's taking over America, which just didn't happen. A British rock band. It was all kind of weird initially that it took off the way they did for them, because they were basically bringing rock and blues, back to the States. That's been said many times. Them and the Stones and a lot of these groups that were inspired by the blues, as I was too. The acoustic blues was a big thing for me. Mainly it was records, because there weren't a lot of great radio stations there back then. I listened to pop radio when I was a kid, but really when I was in high school, that's when I started listening to a Brown University's radio station, and that's when college radio really started to be a thing in the 80s. I was listening to that's how I found out about a lot of the music. U2, them arriving in the States. I heard their first concert because it was done in Providence, Rhode Island, and that was where this Brown radio was coming from. So that's how I found a lot of the sort of new wavy punk stuff that I listened to. Before that, it was albums. I read, Rolling Stone and Relics magazines when I could get a hold of them, and I read reviews religiously, which was ironic because I ended up writing album reviews myself for magazines years later, alongside doing gigs in New York. I started writing, and that just kind of became a sideline for me along with my regular day job. And it was nice because I made some money that way, but it was also sort of confusing because I was getting published, but, and sort of getting published in People and Rolling Stone and Musician magazine. Just reviews and stuff, but still I was getting published while my music career was not really going anywhere past playing gigs at local places, CBGBs and whatnot.
And what are you playing? Give me if there is one, like a trajectory of you pick up the instruments, an instrument, and then what music are you playing?
Oh, okay. Well, I mainly acoustic guitar is sort of where I start. And then when I start playing in bands, I actually played bass mostly. And so when I got out of college, I went through a time of playing in the folk club called Folk City a lot. And that sort of, I got as far as I could. And the booker basically said, hey, you should really be in a rock band. Because I was a little too rocky for this folk acoustic club. And I was so mad at him for saying that I went and started a band. And so I started playing at places like CBGB's and downtown Beirut and all sorts of awful clubs in Manhattan, and was playing kind of new wavy stuff, and that ended up being kind of a dance band. I'd say like kind of B-52s were maybe an inspiration.
Okay.
Not quite that kitschy, but something like a new wave dance sort of thing was what we were going for. And then that's when I kind of hit the end of the road, and I was burned out. I'd like been playing for 7 years solid, and just feeling like at 26 all washed up, Oh God.
I mean, it's what is it? Athletes and musicians, by 27, 28.
Oh, yeah.
You're either a world champion or you're done.
Yeah. You've either established a career and, figured out how to work the business side, which I just never got past my own sort of inflated sense of, oh, I'm an artist. I don't know how to sell myself. I mean, I used to say shit like that, and it's just, I could go back and smack myself in the face. But, a lot of people just sort of don't make the jump into realizing this is a business. If you have something that you think people want, you have to treat it like it's a business. I mean, not that it isn't artistic, and not that it doesn't require a lot of soul searching and that kind of thing, but just that I was so averse to actually learning about how maybe to get people to come to gigs and how to advertise or promote or stuff like that. So that was another thing when I started podcasting, just to dip back into that for a second, that I consciously did what I used to say no to. I mean, I promoted, I taught myself how to promote. I realized that networking wasn't a dirty word, that actually I was meeting through the podcast. I was hooking up with, people like you and Ginger and Grant and Hershon and, all these cool people that were just like nerdy guys who wanted to do a podcast like me, and they were doing their things. And so that was, another sort of odd offshoot of my music career never really sort of getting anywhere. I learned by doing the opposite of what I tried to do as a musician.
I will say it's one of the curious conundrums of podcasting is that most people are willing to hit record and literally share themselves with like intimate, like this is who I am. And then they'll tell all their friends to listen. But when it comes to the promotion, they always fall short.
Yeah.
And it's that little extra mile, right? Like listen to any interview on any podcast of a band you love, and then listen to 12 others of different bands, and they all say the same thing, right? Like, we started out, it was hard. We started in clubs. I remember walking around just putting leaflets on, cars and just pounding the pavement, and we'd go from city to city, keep doing that, this, that, and the other thing. Now, obviously, the digital equivalent is like, well, you have to tweet about it all the time.
Right.
But you have to do that. It's not just enough to put out good art and let it, and people, it's not Field of Dreams. It's
the old, I mean, I really was thinking that someone, when I was playing in clubs in New York, that someone would walk in and discover me, like Brian Epstein and the Beatles, but the lesson of the Beatles is they were so good, somebody was going to discover them. Somebody was going to come and say, I can make money off of this. It's just what ultimately a manager would say, but I can package this. This is something that will interest people.
By the way, I want to tell you. So I watched, it's a Netflix documentary, or maybe it's not, but it was a documentary on Netflix called Echo in the Canyon.
Oh yeah, I just watched that.
And
we just watched that.
And you talking about the Beatles and packaging is my favorite line from that. It's the guy from the Byrds is talking about the fact that they ran into the Beatles and they were talking about the fact that the Byrds got to wear whatever they wanted to. And the Beatles, for the longest time, especially early on, that they were wearing the same outfits. They were basically wearing a uniform almost. And
oh yeah,
I think it was John's like, why do you guys get to wear whatever you want? And the guy from the Byrds is like, oh, well, before one of our television gigs, we lost our luggage. And then we never went back to wearing the same thing ever again. And I was just like, well, that's just the oddest happenstance. And it took the Beatles like more years to be able to wear whatever they wanted to.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, in fairness, the uniform can really work. I mean, it worked for them. It worked for the Ramones. You know, just having something that distinctive as a look, that was a big deal. I mean, maybe they got sick of it. I'm sure. Within a couple of years, but when they made that change, it was. I don't know. It worked for them. It sure did work.
So I want to focus on a little piece of this because I've been getting back into Dylan and some folk. What got you into folk? Because I mean, from everything you're saying, you seem to be more of a blues rock guy, and I'm completely a folk apologist, where it's just like, well, folk is no different than blues.
Oh yeah, I was very big into actually English folk mostly. But also, I was a huge Pete Seeger fan. I saw him perform twice. He was just incandescent. And I was also a big fan of a British guitarist and singer called Martin Carthy, who I also got to see live. And these British groups that some of them he was involved with, like Fairport Convention, Steel Eye Span, he was in that, and the Albion Country Band. I don't know if you're familiar with any of that stuff.
Pete Seeger's the only name out of that I recognize.
So far, okay. Oh, well.
So I've got some homework to do.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. If you like English and, Irishy stuff, yeah. They were very big in the 70s. So, yeah, Pete Seeger, let's see, other Americans. I mean, I met Odetta once. I heard lots of people at Folk City in New York, lots of acoustic folks. I mean, I opened for John Hammond once. He was terrific. Folk was a big interest for me. I guess Peter, Paul, and Mary too. When I was younger, they were kind of, them and the Beatles were kind of what I was listening to when I learned how to play guitar. So I started with their songs a lot. A lot of it was Beatles and Where Have All the Flowers Gone, stuff like that. So yeah, folk was a big part of me learning. And then blues, folk blues, it all does sort of blend together in a weird way. I mean, on a sort of spectrum, I guess you'd say, but they're all connected because, bluegrass is basically fiddle tunes from Scotland and stuff, and then blues is music from Africa combined with some elements from Mexican music. Like when they started to do the electric bands with the drums doing the part, that's like straight out of Mexican music. The hi-hat cymbal keeping time and stuff, and jazz. I mean, it's So anyway, I'm not a musicologist. I'm just sort of rambling here, but folk was a big part of it. It's interesting that you sort of picked that out somehow.
It's kind of one of those things that kind of gets it, like sitting here, like taking it all in. It kind of puts you on a trajectory, because the one thing that folk does, and will continue to do is storytell.
Yeah.
And it's kind of where you ended up. It's almost like it kind of was like the lubricant that sped you towards storytelling a little bit further from your Goon's origins of inspiration. Because it's like, well, you just got more immersed in a different kind of storytelling, like that you were never going to get far away from it.
Definitely. Yeah, that's interesting. Because even when I was recording music and trying to be, a rock guy, I would occasionally do these little weird sketches with my friend Charles, also using, Tascam 4-track recorders and stuff. I was using them, and then an 8-track machine that he got. It was a 1-inch tape. I think it was 1 inch. And so all of that stuff, we'd occasionally just do a silly, sketchy kind of bit with funny voices and sound effects just to amuse ourselves. And so, storytelling, songwriting, of course, was a huge thing for me too. And I think that teaches you how to write short ideas, short, fleshed out ideas, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, I have a lot of short, unfleshed out ideas as well. I mean, it comes part and parcel, right? Like for every finished product you've got, regardless of the medium that your art is in, you've got hundreds of thousands of unfinished ones, and a good portion of those unfinished ones end up half-started, is what I'll call it. Yeah, sure. There's definitely unfinished bits lying around.
So ends this chapter of the legend, of the myth, of the allegory, of the tale, of the fable, of the sock, of the hand that gripped the armrest of the throne gamely.
Talking with Geoffrey about our respective histories in music and technology, it is easy in hindsight to say that podcasting was our destiny. But in those moments when we were young, when we were doing those things, we weren't looking forward to talking on microphones with each other and creating podcasts. We were hoping to be rock stars. And while it's easy to look back and see the things that we didn't do, you have to keep your eyes forward. Now, sure, this sounds very similar to the sentiment of my conversation with Tristan Boyle about knowing your history, being present, and keeping an eye on the future. But this conversation, that moment of connection between our pasts, that this is what we're doing now and that we're not rock stars, is what I like to see as a testament to our fortitude. We didn't get to be rock stars, but we adapted. We continued to create in other ways, and yes, Geoffrey a little more than me, we both still pick up our instruments and play. You don't have to give up on the things that you like or love. Utilize the inspiration that comes with those things, whatever they are, as fuel to create or accomplish something you want to do. And if you end up loving it and loving the process, all the better. Now, a correction in the episode in that Welcome to What's It Called was the Welcome to the Night Vale podcast. Neither of us could remember it at the time of recording, so to all of you who were screaming at us, we're sorry, and to those of you who had no idea what we were forgetting, now you know. Lastly, don't forget to reach out to the podcasts whose content you enjoy. Remember, even the smallest message can go a long way. All of us who talk into the void, that's what podcasting basically is, we enjoy hearing from those of you who listen to us. So reach out. Don't be afraid. We're the ones who have to hit publish. You're the ones who hit play. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files Episode 7. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for some official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion and let me know what you think. You can tweet the podcast at The Palmer Files, myself at Agent Palmer, and reach this week's guest, Geoffrey, at Welchmania. The show email is thepalmerfiles@gmail.com, and don't forget to visit agentpalmer.com to see what else I've got going on. You can also hear more of me in the meantime on Our Liner Notes, a musical conversation podcast with host Chris Meyer, and my other gig as co-host of the Podcast Digest with Dan Lizette. So, Geoffrey, before we go, do you have one final question for me?
I do, Jason. Jason, tell me, who or what is Agent Palmer?
So, this is my Tony Stark moment. I am Agent Palmer. No,
Yes. What is that? What is
so
that?
when I was getting ready to start the blog, I realized that I didn't necessarily want to write under my name. I didn't know what the blog was going to become. I just knew I wanted to start one, and I was like, well, what do I need a brand. And I've always been a fan of James Bond, but I didn't want to necessarily go that direction. And it had just so happened that, I don't know, I want to give credit to my mother for something in regards to Palmer. So I'm going to give her credit for this. I think my mother was explaining to me that Michael Caine playing Austin Powers' father in the movie was funny because he used to do spy flicks in the 60s. So
Right, yeah.
I went back and I was like, well, all right, I'm game for anything, and it's not Bond, so it should be very interesting. And so I watched the Ipcress file.
Oh, okay, which I have not seen.
And I watched the Ipcress file, and then I burned through Funeral in Berlin and Bullet to Beijing, I think, are the 3 movies. Now, listen, Ipcress file is the best one of all of them. But he was Harry Palmer in that.
He was Harry Palmer, right. Okay.
So I was like, well, I can't actually crib the name. I can't be Harry Palmer because that's a guy played by Michael Caine. But I can be Agent Palmer. And because I'm also an Orioles fan, it had the nice Jim Palmer, thing.
Of course, yeah.
So it became
Jim Palmer. He was huge.
Agent Palmer is what it became, and then it was like an afterthought, right? It was just all right, that's fine. And then I started the blog and I started writing, and nobody said anything, right? I start my Twitter at Agent Palmer, and then of course I'm not going to use my face because I'm not using my name, so I'll put up a picture of Michael Caine from the Ipcress file. And, then it's not until Grant and 7 Days a Geek, because Grant gets the reference.
He got it.
Grant's the one who, and I don't know when it is, but when I first start showing up in the chat rooms for 7 Days a Geek's live episodes, you'll hear Grant not say Palmer. He says Harry.
Oh,
at least in the very beginning, before he even knew who I really was.
Yeah, I was on one of those. Do you remember? I was on one of those live shows.
I was, I'm going to say yes, because I went back. I actually went back through the 7 Days a Geek, back catalog. So I would have heard it. But at one point, I think it was after I did the Stranger Cons, Grant went back to the Agent Palmer and stopped calling me Harry. But occasionally, Grant will call me Harry because he was the one who got it. And now, my Twitter now says my real name. And on this show, I, use my real name. And I've kind of started to move out from behind. I mean, at some point,
and your real voice.
My real voice. I mean, it's always been my real voice. And it's I guess here's the worst kept secret about Agent Palmer. I didn't change anything. I didn't pretend to like anything. I didn't pretend to hate anything. My personality was exactly the same. All I was doing was using a pen name. I didn't.
Oh, that's good. Though, I mean, I totally get it. I thought it was something to do with the X-Files, to be honest.
No, and there's
I didn't.
There's
know.
a Palmer, an Agent Palmer on NCIS that will come up in Google searches.
Oh, okay.
I occasionally I rank ahead of that. If you just Google Agent Palmer, so I always go check to see where I am in the rankings for Agent Palmer. And that's basically the story. But I got to give my mother credit for explaining to me why Michael Caine was chosen as Austin Powers' father.
Well, way to go, Mom.